Spring of 1834 came late to the Green River Valley. Snow still clung in dirty patches beneath the sage and cottonwoods, and the river, swollen with meltwater, ran brown and restless through the plain. Along its banks men gathered by the hundreds, French-Canadian voyageurs with bright sashes and beaded pipe bags, Americans in fringed buckskin, half-breeds from the Platte and the Yellowstone, even a handful of Shoshone, silent and watchful. The air smelled of wood smoke, beaver pelts, horse sweat, and cheap whiskey. The mountain men called it a rendezvous, but to anyone who hadn't seen one, it was more like a moving city, a brief republic of wilderness men and traders, flaring into life for a few weeks each summer before dissolving again into the wild. And in the center of that noise and barter and laughter, men whispered of a map. They said it had been drawn in Spanish ink on a square of lambskin so thin you could read a Bible verse through it. They said the script was older than the Revolution, that it had come out of New Mexico with a dying friar who'd begged his rescuers to carry it north to the Valle de la Plata, the Valley of Silver. Others swore it was a fraud, a whiskey-born fancy from some Taos gambler, but none could stop talking about it. The man who owned it kept mostly to himself, Elias Boone Hardesty. He was not a loud man, nor one to boast. When others traded stories of frozen toes, grizzly fights, and horse thieves, Elias listened in silence, turning a twig between his fingers, his gray eyes steady and unreadable. His hands were scarred and square, blackened from years at the forge. Before he'd come west, he'd been a blacksmith's apprentice in Street Charles, Missouri. Some said he'd left after killing a man in a river-town brawl. Others whispered that he'd simply grown tired of shaping other men's tools. Whatever the truth, he drifted up the Missouri with a keelboat in '30, wintered near Fort Union, and vanished into the mountains soon after. 4 years later, he came back with a pack of pelts, a horse that limped, and a map folded in oilskin. That spring at Green River, the talk about the Spanish mines burned hotter than the cook fires. Traders from the American Fur Company mocked it at first. "A map to the moon," one said. "Next, he'll sell you a road to Jerusalem." But others, men who'd followed Jedediah Smith's trails or trapped beside Hugh Glass, knew better than to laugh too quickly. The mountains had a way of burying truth and treasure together. Elias didn't show the map openly. He kept it in a flat tin box, wrapped in deerskin, and carried close under his coat. Only a few men had ever seen it. One was Etienne Dupré, a French Creole trapper from Kaskaskia, with a face weathered like rawhide and a laugh that came seldom but honestly. Dupré had once traded silver trinkets among the Utes and claimed he'd seen old workings in the San Juan country timbers, black with age, chisels left to rust in stone. On the second night of the rendezvous, while drunken shooting contests echoed down the valley and the traders' tents glowed with lantern light, Dupré sat across from Elias by a small fire. Between them, the tin box lay unopened. "You keep feeding that thing smoke instead of sense," Dupré said, jerking his chin toward it. "If it's what they say, you and me could ride south, fill our saddlebags with enough silver to buy a steamboat." Elias poked the fire with a stick. "Silver's heavy," he said at last. "And men kill easy for it." Dupré grinned. "So do wolves kill easy for meat. That's no reason to starve." Elias looked up then, and Dupré saw the faint white seam that ran from his left temple down through his beard to his collarbone. "Some things are bought too dear," Elias said softly. He rose and walked to the river. The sound of drums and fiddle drifted across the water, wild and half in tune. He stood, a long time watching the moonlight on the current. When he came back, the map was gone from the firelight. It wasn't until the next morning that he showed it. A handful of men had gathered Dupré among them, and an old mountain hand named Hatcher, who'd once trapped with Bridger. Elias unfolded the lambskin slowly. The ink had faded to a reddish brown, but the lines were still sharp. A chain of mountains ran diagonally across the page, marked with a crooked cross. Below it, in looping Spanish hand, were the words, "Minas del Espiritu Santo." Hatcher squinted. "That'd be the San Juans, sure as sin." "I seen them crosses carved on trees down there, Franciscan sign maybe." Elias nodded. "The friars went north from Santa Fe about 70 years ago. Their trail ended in the high country, never came back. This map was found with one of their mules, half-starved, near the Rio Chama. "Then you believe it?" Dupré asked. "I believe what I can see," Elias said. "And I seen rock that don't belong to this range veins of galena, bright as fire when you break it. Somebody worked them once. Somebody could again." Hatcher leaned closer. "You think to go after it?" Elias folded the map, slid it back into its tin. "Maybe," he said, "if the snow lets up by July." Word spread quick as gunpowder. Before sundown, half the rendezvous had heard that Elias Hardesty meant to find the lost Spanish mines. Some called him fool, others tried to buy into the venture with rifles, horses, or whiskey. But Elias refused all offers. "Too many hands spoil the trail," he told Dupré, "and too much talk draws thieves." That night the sky flared with northern lights, a green fire rippling over the mountains. The trappers took it as a sign, though none could agree what kind. For Elias, it meant only that the season had turned. He lay awake in his blanket roll, the smell of sage and gun oil around him, listening to the murmurs of men and coyotes alike. He thought of iron cooling in a forge, of sparks dying to ash. He thought of the friars who'd gone south with their faith and their greed, and of the mountains waiting still. Before dawn he packed his gear rifle, traps, flint, the tin box, and saddled his horse. Dupré was waiting, pipe clenched between his teeth. "You sure you want company?" he asked. Elias swung into the saddle. "A man needs someone to talk to, or he starts hearing the wind answer back." Dupré laughed, low and hoarse. "Then let's go ask the wind where it buried the silver." They rode out as the first light touched the peaks, two silhouettes moving south across the valley. Behind them, smoke from the rendezvous curled upward like the last breath of winter. Ahead lay a country no map could promise, and no man had ever claimed for long. And in Elias Boone Hardesty's coat, close against his heart, the Spanish map waited, ink faded, edges frayed, but lines still true, pointing toward the mountains where smoke and silver both had stories yet to tell. By midsummer of 1834, the snow had thinned on the high ridges, and the trails leading south from Green River lay open again. Elias Boone Hardesty and Etienne Dupré followed the faint line of an old trapping path that curved through the Hoback Basin and over the Gros Ventre Range, crossing country that even seasoned mountain men seldom risked so early. Their horses moved slow through the melt-swollen creeks, hooves sinking into mud that smelled of thawed pine and old earth. Each morning frost still glazed their blankets. Each noon the sun scorched their backs until the sweat cut channels through the trail dust. They traveled mostly in silence. Dupré smoked and muttered in French when his horse stumbled. Elias rode ahead, eyes tracing the ridges as if reading some language written in stone. The tin box with the map stayed wrapped in his bedroll, opened only at night when they camped beside a stream or in a patch of quaking aspen. He would study it by firelight, comparing its drawn rivers and crooked cross with the lay of the land. "Does it ever match?" Dupré asked one night, watching the flicker on Elias's face. "Sometimes," Elias said, "mostly it argues with itself, but so do men." They both laughed quietly. A week later, they reached the Wind River. Its current was swift and cold, curling white around boulders. On the far bank stood a ring of cottonwoods, and beneath them a small encampment of Shoshone hunters. The men watched in silence as Elias and Dupré crossed, leading their horses. An old man stepped forward, wrapped in a buffalo robe even in the heat. His eyes were sharp, his hair streaked with gray. Dupré hailed him in a mix of broken Crow and French, but it was Elias the old man studied. When the two parties finally shared fire and trade that evening, the Shoshone elder took a coal from the fire and drew a rough symbol in the dirt across atop three small peaks. He looked at Elias and said a word, "Pa Vantu." Dupré translated loosely. "He says, 'Mountain of the Spirits.' Same as your map's name, maybe." Elias's heartbeat quickened. "Ask him if he has seen men work the earth there digging, with tools." The old man frowned, thinking, then made a hammering motion. "Long ago," Dupré translated. "White men in brown robes. They cut into the mountain and took the white stone. Then the mountain spoke and buried them." Elias leaned forward. "What does he mean, spoke?" Dupré asked, listened, and shrugged. "Thunder, maybe, or avalanche. Either way, they died there. That night Elias sat awake beside the coals long after the camp slept. The elder's words fit too neatly with the map's legend to dismiss. Somewhere south, beyond the Wind River, a place existed where friars had dug for silver until the earth silenced them. He thought of Jedediah Smith, of the entries from 29 where Smith had spoken of rumors of ancient workings in the mountains south of the Yampa. Elias had copied that line from a borrowed journal at Fort Union years before. Maybe Smith had heard the same tale, maybe even seen the same cross carved in stone. By the time the morning star rose, Elias had made up his mind. They would turn toward the south forks of the Green, then push into the Uintas and beyond, following the trail of the friars. The weeks that followed burned the softness out of both men. The heat came fierce by day, cold by night. They saw no trappers, only the wide country of elk and pine and thunder. Dupré grew thin and short-tempered. Elias's beard went iron-gray with dust. Once, in a canyon near the Yampa, they found signs that made both men pause timbers half buried in scree, blackened as if by old fire. Elias pried one loose with his knife. The cut was clean, squared by an iron tool, not stone. Spanish work, he said quietly. Dupré spat. Could be from any trader's pack. Frame. Elias turned the timber in his hands. No, this was beamwood, heavy construction. They built something here. He followed the line of the canyon wall, eyes narrowing. Faint on the rock face above them, half worn away by wind, was a mark across carved deep, weathered but plain. Elias touched it with his fingers. The mark of the fathers, he said. Dupré shook his head. Or of fools. But that night even Dupré sat close to the fire, watching the shadows with a new unease. By the time they reached Brown's Park in late August, their supplies were thin. The horses showed ribs, and Elias's powder horn was nearly empty. Still, the map seemed to pull him onward, each ridge and river more certain in his mind. He marked distances in his small journal, noting timberline to the south, possible entry to Espiritu Santo Valley. Dupré, less convinced, spoke of turning back before the snows. "Ain't no silver worth dying cold for," he said. Elias only smiled faintly. "If we stop now, we've got nothing but blisters and empty bellies to show." "One more range, Dupré muttered, "and the devil himself will meet us on the pass." Elias looked toward the southern horizon, where the peaks shimmered like ghosts in the haze. "Then we'll know the devil's country, won't we?" When they made camp that evening, a storm gathered over the western hills. Lightning walked the ridge tops, and thunder rolled down the valley like a drum. Elias watched it from under the tarp, feeling the same thrill that had driven him west years ago, the call of what lay hidden, half true, half lie, waiting for the man stubborn enough to look. He took the map from its tin box, held it up to the lightning's flash. The inked cross seemed to gleam for an instant, as if alive. He smiled to himself, rain dripping from his beard. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we find where the fathers fell, and in the darkness the storm answered, deep and distant, like the mountain remembering its own voice." The trail south of Brown's Park was no trail at all, just wind-scoured ridges, gullies choked with deadfall, and the thin silver thread of the Green River winding far below like a vein through stone. Elias Boone Hardesty and Etienne Dupré rode single file, their horses weary and hollow-flanked, their packs lighter with every passing day. By early September, the wind had turned sharp. The aspens on the slopes shimmered gold, and the scent of snow lived in every breath. Elias felt the season closing around them like a gate. They followed the map as far as sense allowed, though the lambskin sheet offered more riddle than direction. Rivers wandered where no rivers should, mountains rose where the land lay flat. But every evening Elias studied it again, tracing its crooked cross and its jagged lines by firelight, as if the act of looking alone might coax the land to confess. Dupré grew restless. "You treat that map like it's scripture," he said one night, stirring beans in a soot-black pot. "But scripture never filled a man's belly." Elias looked up from the fire. "Neither does doubt." Dupré grunted, chewing in silence. Beyond them, the coyotes were already calling, thin and hungry. The next morning they rode into a basin ringed by cliffs as red as dried blood. There the air tasted of iron. Elias dismounted, picked a fragment of rock from the wash, and cracked it open with the butt of his rifle. Inside, the surface gleamed faintly. "Galena," he murmured. "Lead mixed with silver." Dupré spat on the ground. "Or fool's shine. You see light and call it treasure." Elias slipped the stone into his pouch. "Light is what men have followed since they learned to walk upright." They camped that night under a leaning shelf of sandstone. The firelight danced against the wall, revealing faint markings, scratches, symbols maybe. Elias took a coal from the fire and traced them with his fingers. The lines curved into something deliberate, a crude cross flanked by what looked like a sunburst. He felt his pulse quicken. "They came this far," he said quietly. Dupré leaned close, squinting. "Or some boy with a knife did." But Elias knew better. He had studied enough from the journals of Jedediah Smith and the pages of Devoto to recognize the signs of the early Spanish missions, those who moved north with a mule train, chasing rumor and miracle both. He marked the wall with charcoal, noting the date in his own small book, the 11th of September, 1834, of the Cross of the Red Basin. 3 days later, the weather turned. Clouds stacked over the peaks like iron anvils, and the wind carried a taste of sleet. They pushed eastward, hoping to find a pass-through to the San Juan country before the snow sealed it. The horses balked in the cold. Dupré cursed in 3 languages. Elias only pressed on, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. At dawn on the 4th day, they climbed to the Powder Divide, a long spine of stone cutting between the basins. From the crest, the world spread below them in vast silence. To the north, the familiar line of the Wind Rivers. To the south, a maze of broken mesas and valleys where the land seemed to fold into itself. "There," Elias said, pointing. "See that gorge, running west to east? That's where the map's river bends." Dupré shaded his eyes. "Could be any gorge. Maybe." But the friars drew their cross just beyond it. They descended by noon, sliding down shale and scree, half on foot. The gorge turned out to be deeper than it looked, a wound in the earth carved by centuries of meltwater. At its base ran a narrow stream, green with minerals. The rocks shimmered with veins of quartz and ore. Elias knelt beside the water, cupping it in his hands. It tasted metallic. "This is it," he whispered, "the Valley of the Spirit." Dupré looked around at the barren cliffs, unimpressed. If this is the Spirit's Valley, he must be poor company. But Elias was already searching the canyon walls. There, half hidden by lichen, was another cross, larger, carved clean into the stone. Below it, a faint line of symbols, worn smooth but still visible. He traced them reverently. "Same hand as the last," he said. "They were here." Dupré shook his head. "And now they're bones if the mountain didn't eat them." Elias stood, brushing dust from his palms. "Maybe it did, but the mountain doesn't lie." That evening they built no fire. The wind howled through the gorge, and the cold bit deep. Elias wrote in his journal by the fading light, September 15, found carvings resembling Spanish hand, possible mine shafts nearby. Before he closed the book, he added another line. If the legend is true, the mountain buried not only silver, but men's souls with it. He stared into the dark for a long time after. Somewhere down the canyon, a loose stone clattered. Both men froze. "Deer?" Dupré whispered. Elias shook his head. That was a man's step. They drew their rifles, listening. A shadow moved between boulders, a flicker of shape, then gone. Dupré hissed a curse. "Bandits from Taos, maybe," he muttered. "Word travels, they follow fools with silver dreams." Elias said nothing. He knew too well what greed drew from the dark. He packed the map away, tight and silent, and they took turns keeping watch through the night. At dawn, snow began to fall, soft, fine, unending. The gorge vanished into white haze. Elias mounted, looking once more toward the carved cross. "Not yet," he said under his breath. "Not this season." Dupré looked at him. "Then we go back?" Elias nodded. "For now. But I'll remember where the cross stands." They turned their horses north, the snow thickening around them, erasing their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. By the time they reached the divide again, the land behind them was gone, buried under a silence so complete that it felt like the mountain's own secret. And somewhere beneath that silence, the silver still waited, untouched, whispering faintly to the man who had almost found it. By the spring thaw of 1835, Elias Boone Hardesty returned to the mountains with new purpose. The snows had receded down the ridges like retreating ghosts, and the rivers roared fat with meltwater. He and Etienne Dupré rode south once more, following the half-forgotten route they had marked with charcoal the year before. They carried less now, no traps, no trade goods, only rifles, a pick and spade, powder, and the small tin box with the Spanish map. The valley they sought lay somewhere beyond the broken spine of the San Juans, where the old friars had vanished generations before. By late May, they reached the Red Gorge again. The carved cross still marked the wall, half veiled by new moss. Elias touched it with the back of his hand, almost reverent. "Still here," he murmured. Dupré spat into the dirt. "So are bones. Let's hope they stay quiet." The wind carried the scent of juniper and wet stone. For 3 days they searched along the gorge's length, climbing ledges and combing draws. On the 4th morning, Elias found what they had missed the year before. Behind a tangle of fallen rock, half hidden by brush, a dark opening cut into the cliff face unnaturally square, framed by hand-hewn timbers black with age. He called Dupré over. Together they cleared the entrance, shoveling away gravel and roots. The timbers groaned but held. Inside, the air was cold and dry, smelling faintly of soot and rust. Elias struck a spark. The lantern light wavered across a narrow tunnel, its walls scored with pick marks, its ceiling braced by crossbeams. Dust motes drifted like ash. "They worked deep," Dupré said quietly. "Spanish for sure." Elias ran his fingers over the tool marks. "And they worked well." They followed the passage inward for perhaps 40 paces, until it opened into a small chamber. There, against the back wall, lay a heap of collapsed timber, the remnants of a cartwheel, and what looked like bones long since turned gray with time. A wooden crucifix, blackened but intact, leaned beside them. Elias knelt, hat in hand. "The fathers," he said softly. "They made it this far." Dupré's voice was low. "And never left." The silence pressed thick around them, broken only by the slow drip of water from the ceiling. Elias's lantern caught a faint shimmer on the wall, a vein of ore running like lightning through the rock. He chipped at it gently with his knife. The stone broke clean, revealing threads of dull silver glinting beneath. Dupré whistled. "By God, you were right." Elias said nothing. The gleam in the rock stirred no joy in him, only a deep unease. He thought of the friars digging here by candlelight, their hymns echoing in the dark, believing they had found heaven's bounty until the earth itself came down upon them. They spent the rest of the day exploring what little of the mine remained. 2 more tunnels branched from the main chamber, both collapsed. Near one of them they found a rusted iron chisel and a scrap of parchment sealed inside a clay jar. The ink had faded, but Elias could still make out fragments in Spanish. "Spiritu Santo, abundant metal, our burden heavy." He folded it gently and placed it in his journal. "Proof enough," he said. That night a storm rolled down from the high peaks. The wind shrieked through the gorge, hurling dust and sleet against the rocks. Elias and Dupré huddled in their blankets near the mine's mouth, the fire burning low. Through the noise of the storm came another sound, a dull thud, then the echo of hooves. Dupré grabbed his rifle. "We're not alone." Elias rose slowly, scanning the darkness. 3 riders emerged from the canyon bend, lantern light, glinting off rifles and Spanish spurs. Taos men, bandits, or deserters from the borderlands. Their leader, a lean fellow with a red sash, hailed them in accented English. "You found what we're looking for, amigos. Hand it over." Elias said nothing. The map was inside his coat, the ore samples in a pouch at his belt. Dupré's fingers tightened on the trigger. The standoff hung thin as wire. Then lightning split the canyon wall, and the air exploded with thunder. In the flash, Dupré fired. 1 rider dropped, his horse rearing. The others answered with wild shots. The fight lasted seconds smoke, shouting the stench of powder. When it cleared, 2 men lay still, and Dupré was down, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. The bandits fled into the storm, their horses vanishing among the rocks. Elias dragged his friend into the mine. The wound was bad, a bullet through the ribs. Dupre's breath came ragged. "You keep your silver," he gasped. "Bury the rest with the ghosts." Elias gripped his shoulder. "Hold on." But Dupre only smiled faintly. "Told you. The devil keeps this valley." Then his eyes went still. Outside, the storm raged on. The mountain groaned as if remembering. Elias sat beside the body until dawn, the lantern guttering low. When the wind died, he went back into the chamber. He gathered what ore he could, sealed the tunnel with rocks, and buried the entrance beneath a small landslide. Above it, he carved a single mark across, the same as the friars had left. In his journal he wrote, "The 3rd of June, 1835. Dupre dead. The mines are real, but cursed. The earth should keep what men cannot bear." Then he packed his tools, shouldered his rifle, and rode north alone. Weeks later, near the Green River, he met a small party of trappers heading to Fort Davy Crockett. One of them, an old hand named Carson, asked where he'd been wintering. Elias looked toward the southern peaks, now hazed with summer heat. "Just chasing ghosts," he said. Carson laughed. "Did you catch any?" Elias smiled thinly. "No. But I learned their trade." That night, as he camped alone by the river, he took the map from its tin box one last time. The ink was faded beyond reading, edges worn and brittle. He fed it to the fire and watched it curl into smoke. In the darkness, he whispered a prayer, neither Spanish nor English, but something older, a plea that the mountain keep its silence. The embers glowed red as molten silver. When the snows returned to the Wind River country that autumn, Elias Boone Hardesty came with them. He rode alone, a darker shape moving through the gray of early winter, his pack-horse heavy with furs, tools, and memory. The gorge and the buried mine lay weeks behind him, now sealed, as he had sworn, by stone and silence. He crossed into the Yellowstone country by mid-December, where the rivers ran steaming from hidden springs and the peaks shone blue with ice. It was a land too hard for settlers, too far for trade. And that suited him. He meant to build something that would stand when men no longer did. Elias found his place on a shoulder of pine above the upper Madison, an open bench overlooking the river bend, with plenty of timber and a cold spring nearby. He called it nothing. The trappers who later came through would name it Ironwood Ridge. He began cutting logs before the new year. The cold worked like a hammer on his lungs, but his hands never lost rhythm. From his years at the forge in Missouri, he knew strength came from how a thing was joined, not how much it weighed. Every notch he cut was measured, every beam locked with dovetails tight enough to sing when struck. He built alone for nearly 2 months, sleeping under hides and snow when the storms came, eating dried meat and melted snow. Sometimes, when the wind blew down from the Absarokas, he thought he heard Dupre's laugh soft, mocking, but he never stopped his work. By late February, the cabin stood complete, 12 by 16 feet, roofed with pine shingles hardened by fire, sealed with clay and ash. The corners were interlocked, the walls layered double thick. When the first thaw came, the water ran off without soaking a joint. Inside, he set a hearth of river stone, its mortar a blend of sand and powdered bone, something he'd learned from the miners' ruins. He fitted the chimney with a narrow throat so no spark could escape. When the first fire burned there, the draft drew clean, the smoke rising like a prayer through the cold air. He wrote in his journal, "The 10th of March, 1836, the house stands, built to outlast the man. The first to see it that spring were a small band of crow hunters passing through. They circled the cabin warily, thinking it a trapper's fort. Elias came out slow, rifle low, hands open. Their leader, a young man with a white-tipped feather in his braid, studied him a long while before speaking. Through sign and the few words of Crow he knew from Schultz's teachings, Elias offered them tobacco and fire. The young leader gestured at the cabin, then struck his fist against the wall, surprised by its strength. He said a word Elias didn't know. Later, one of the older men explained through signs, "Stone that breathes." Elias nodded. "Wood that doesn't break," he answered. They stayed 2 nights. On the second evening, the old man told him a story, how the spirits of the mountains took pity on men who built with respect, how a dwelling could become part of the earth if its maker gave it enough of his own life. Elias listened in silence, the firelight moving across his face. When the hunters left, he gave them dried meat and the last of his tobacco. That summer, the cabin became more than shelter. It was experiment, prayer, penance, all in one. Elias built a forge beside it, bellows fashioned from elk hide and willow. With ore fragments from his pouch, he smelted small ingots of silver mixed with iron, forging hinges and bolts that would not rust. He tested the walls by hammering them with a maul, by striking the corners with his axe. Nothing yielded. In July, a grizzly came down from the ridge, drawn by the scent of salted hides. It clawed at the door, bellowing. The logs held. By dawn, the bear limped away, bleeding from its own strength, turned back against it. Elias wrote again, July 22. Cabin endures what man cannot. I begin to think wood may have soul. By autumn, the valley turned gold with willow and aspen. Elias traded once at Fort Hall, bringing in furs enough to buy powder and salt. The traders asked about the stories. Some said there was a cabin upriver that couldn't be broken by axe or flame. Elias only smiled and said, "A man builds what he needs." He returned before the snows, sealing himself in again for another winter. When the wind howled down the chimney, the cabin didn't shudder. When frost cracked the river's skin, the walls stayed warm. He began carving small crosses into the beams, one for each man he had known, and buried Smith, Dupré, the nameless friars, all swallowed by the same indifferent mountains. Some nights he dreamed of them, standing outside in the snow, their faces calm, their voices like the shifting pines. He would wake to the sound of the fire breathing and the cabin answering, with soft creaks, as if alive. By the spring of 1837, other trappers had seen it, an unbreakable cabin on the upper Madison, built by a solitary man. They called it Hardesty's Folly, then later Hardesty's Miracle. No one could burn it down, though some tried after he vanished. No rot touched its beams. When lightning struck the ridge in '42, every tree nearby burned, but the cabin remained, smoke-blackened yet standing. In time, the forest reclaimed it, but the walls endured still, buried in moss and shadow. When surveyors found the ruin decades later, they marveled at its construction. The dovetails, the clay seal, the strange alloy of the hinges. An impossible invention, one called it, made by a man who knew both fire and sorrow. Elias Boone Hardesty's journal ends with a single line, written the day before he disappeared, the 2nd of April, 1837. The cabin stands. May it hold against the world when I no longer can. And so it did. The third winter found Elias Boone Hardesty still on Ironwood Ridge, though the man who had built the unbreakable cabin was no longer quite the same. His beard had gone to white at the edges, his shoulders stooped, and a heaviness lived behind his eyes that no amount of work could hammer out. The cabin stood as firm as ever, each log weathered to a dark bronze sheen, but its strength only deepened the silence that filled it. Snow fell early that year, thick and unbroken. The river froze in great plates that groaned at night, and the forest muffled even the sound of wolves. For weeks, Elias saw no other living soul. He rose before dawn, split wood, checked his snares, wrote in his journal by the faint light that seeped through the smoke hole. His entries grew shorter, colder, like chipped stone. Hawk tracks by spring, elk moving west, firewood low. In the evenings he sometimes spoke aloud, first to the fire, then to no one at all. "A man builds walls for warmth," he would mutter, and finds he's built a tomb instead. On the morning of the year's first real thaw, a sound broke the long silence. Dogs barking, voices calling in a language not English. Elias stepped outside, rifle in hand. Across the clearing, 3 crow hunters stood beside their ponies. One of them, he recognized the young man with the white-tipped feather from the year before. The hunters greeted him with open hands. Behind them rode a woman wrapped in a robe of elk hide, her hair braided with red beads. Her eyes were dark, calm, and strangely familiar. She dismounted without a word, looked at the cabin, then at Elias. The young man spoke briefly, explaining that she was kin to their healer sent north to gather roots from the hot springs before the snows returned. Elias nodded and gestured toward the fire. "You're welcome to rest," he said, though he knew they understood only fragments of his words. The woman smiled faintly and set down her bundle. When the others left to hunt, she stayed, helping him mend a broken latch. Her hands were quick and sure, her presence quiet. When she laughed at his clumsy attempt to repeat her name, Sa'ape, which meant spring water, the cabin felt less empty for the first time in months. Over the next days, they fell into a rhythm of wordless companionship. She showed him herbs that soothed fever. He taught her how to temper a knife edge on the forge's heat. When she spoke, it was softly, as though to the forest itself. Sometimes he caught her humming an old melody near the door, the sound weaving through the crackle of the fire like a memory of warmer places. One night, as the wind clawed at the shutters, she asked in halting English, "Why you live here alone?" Elias looked into the flames for a long time before answering. "Because the world breaks what it touches. Out here, I break only what I choose." She studied him, then nodded. "Mountain break everything too," she said. "But it give back." He didn't answer, but her words settled deep in him. When the thaw came fully, she prepared to leave, her pack filled with roots and bark. On her last morning, Elias walked with her to the ridge. The river below shone like melted silver. She turned to him, eyes steady. "You still look for something," she said. Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I've stopped believing it's silver." She placed her palm over his chest, where his heartbeat thudded slow and strong. "Then look there," she said simply, and was gone, vanishing into the aspen light. That summer, a government surveyor came riding up from the Yellowstone Valley, thin, sunburned, the kind of man who measured everything he saw. He introduced himself as Captain Henry Devereaux of the Army Topographical Corps. "Hardesty, isn't it? Heard of you at Fort Hall. They say you built a cabin no axe can fell." Elias gave a modest shrug. "Built it to stand. Seems it learned how." Devereaux laughed, then unrolled a map. "We're charting the mineral belt south of here. Spanish mines, old workings, any sign of ore. Thought you might have seen something worth noting." Elias's jaw tightened. "Nothing but rock and ghosts." "Ghosts don't pay," the captain said cheerfully. "The government pays." Elias's eyes hardened. That's what men said when they started digging the first time. The officer looked puzzled. "The first time?" Elias turned away, staring at the horizon where the San Juans rose faint and blue. "Leave that country buried," he said. "The mountain's already been paid in full." Devereaux chuckled, thinking it old man superstition, and rode on. By autumn, Elias's journal entries had grown spare again but softer. Met a woman of the Crow. Kind soul, fire still holds. Dreamed of Dupré, he smiled, said nothing. The final entry of that year read, "Winter comes early. The valley is quiet. Cabin stands strong. I am content to listen." When trappers passed through the next spring, they found the door unlatched, the fire cold, but the walls unmarked. On the table lay Elias's journal, open to the last page, and beside it a small wooden carving, a cross entwined with a feather. No one ever found his body. Some said he went south, following the Crow woman into the plains. Others swore he wandered back toward the gorge, where the mine slept beneath its burden of stone. But those who wintered near the Madison swore that, on still nights, the ironwood cabin gave off a low sound, half sigh, half hum, as if the timbers remembered the man who had built them, and the silence he had learned to love. And so the cabin endured, breathing with the mountain's own slow heart, waiting for spring that might never come. In the summer of 1845, long after Elias Boone Hardesty had vanished from the Madison country, two surveyors from Street Lewis rode north along the Gallatin Trail. Their names were Joseph Prentice and William Keating, young, eager men with ink-stained hands and a government charter to record all notable geographic or mineral features. They'd heard the stories at Fort Hall, as most travelers did, of a mountain man who'd found a lost Spanish mine, then built a cabin that no storm could tear down. Hardesty's Folly, the trappers called it. Others named it the ironwood miracle. To the surveyors it was a curiosity, perhaps a tale born of whiskey and snowbound imagination, but Prentice had an antiquarian's hunger. Somewhere in the folded valleys of the Yellowstone, he believed, fact and myth were the same thing, only waiting to be rediscovered. After 3 weeks of travel, they found it. The cabin stood on its rise above the river, like something the forest had decided to keep. The roof sagged under moss, but the walls were whole. No rot, no gap in the seams. Even the iron fittings on the door gleamed faintly through a film of rust. Keating struck the timber with the butt of his rifle. The sound rang clean, almost metallic. "Lord," he said softly, "he built this like a church." Inside, dust covered everything in a fine gray veil. A stone hearth crouched at the far end, still blackened with old smoke. On the mantel sat a rusted knife, a clay cup, and a single horseshoe, polished smooth by time. Against one wall, they found a small chest made of oak and elk hide. Prentice forced it open carefully. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages dry but intact. The first lines were neat, deliberate. June 1834. Green River, began southward today. Map of Spanish hand, may prove real. Should I perish, may this record speak for me. Keating exhaled. It's him. They read until the light failed the journey, the friars, the mine, Dupre's death, the sealing of the tunnels. The handwriting grew tighter with each year, steadier even as it darkened in tone. The final entries describe the cabin's construction in detail. The dovetail joints, the clay and ash mortar, the alloy of iron and silver used for the hinges. Prentice's hand trembled as he turned the last page. There, beneath a short line dated the 2nd of April, 1837, was a second passage written in smaller script, almost as an afterthought. If the earth should ever open again and men come searching, let them take warning from what it cost. The mountain remembers what we forget. The surveyors packed the journal carefully and left the cabin untouched. At Fort Benton, they delivered it to a passing officer of the Corps of Topographical Engineers, who forwarded it east. Within a year, excerpts were published in the Missouri Gazette, titled Journal of a Forgotten Mountain Man. Scholars debated whether it was genuine. Some argued that the language was too refined for a blacksmith. Others noted the precise references to friar expeditions known only from Spanish archives. By 1850, the story had grown into legend. Prospectors heading toward the San Juans carried copies of the article, convinced the Valley of the Spirits still hid untouched veins of silver. Dozens went searching. None returned with proof. A few came back, broken, starved, frostbitten, or haunted by what they'd seen. One, a Mexican trader named Reyes, claimed to have found the gorge and the carved cross, but said the ground there breathed warm like the belly of the earth, and that no man could sleep within a mile of it without dreaming of fire. The newspapers printed his words, of course, then forgot him. But the legend never died. Decades later, in 1881, when the new rail line reached the Upper Madison, survey crews rediscovered the ironwood cabin. By then, the logs were gray as bone, but the corners still locked tight, the roof unbowed. Engineers examined it, amazed at the joinery. One of them wrote in his report, "Construction impossible by frontier standards. The walls are fused with some mineral compound, perhaps silica or slag. Whoever built it knew the secrets of both fire and time." The cabin was dismantled piece by piece, then reassembled at the fledgling Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale decades later, where it still stands behind glass and cedar rail. Visitors run their fingers along the timbers and wonder how a man alone in the wilderness could have built such perfection. Beside it sits Hardesty's journal, open to the final entry, the ink brown and faded. The cabin stands. May it hold against the world when I no longer can. No one knows what became of the mine he described. Modern archaeologists have searched the high San Juans for traces of the Minas del Espíritu Santo, finding only fragments of timber and a rusted chisel now housed at the National Frontier Trails Museum. Geologists say no rich silver veins exist in that range at all. Historians disagree. pointing to early Franciscan maps from 1765 that mark a Valle de la Plata near the headwaters of the Rio Chama. Even now, when the high country winds carry the smell of iron and rain, some old trappers swear that smoke can still be seen rising faintly from a hidden gorge south of the Green River, thin as a memory, curling upward from a place the earth once swallowed whole. At the museum, a brass plaque rests beneath Hardesty's cabin. The inscription reads, Elias Boone Hardesty, 1798, blacksmith, trapper, builder, seeker of silence. He chased silver and found strength instead. He built a home the world could not break. And in the cool quiet of the exhibit hall, when the crowd drifts on, the wood still creaks, faintly settling, breathing as if the mountain itself is remembering. For some, who stand there listening, it feels less like a legend and more like a confession carried through time. That what men call myth is often just truth, waiting for the noise to fade. By the spring of 1873, the frontier was nearly gone. The railroads had pushed their iron spines through the plains, and the old trappers who had once ruled the wilderness were relics, living history for journalists and dime novelists who'd never spent a night beyond the sound of a church bell. In Denver, a grizzled, one-eyed cartographer named Nathaniel Ware sat hunched over a draft table in the back of the Territorial Survey Office. His left hand trembled from age, but his right still held a pen steady as a rifle sight. On the table lay a sheet of yellowed parchment, an imitation copy of the so-called Hardesty map, sketched from the journals rediscovered decades earlier. Ware had spent 40 years chasing the truth behind it. He had crossed the San Juans, scoured the Rio Chama Valley, and followed every rumor that claimed to know where the friars had dug their silver. But what had begun as adventure had long since become obsession. To his colleagues, he was the last of a dying breed, half-scholar, half-ghost chaser. But to himself, he was the only man still listening to what the mountains whispered when the wind blew right. That spring, a letter arrived from the east. It bore the seal of the Smithsonian Institution. The director wrote that the museum intended to mount a major exhibit on the exploration of the early West, and asked if Ware might contribute his collection of maps, journals, and mineral specimens, including the mysterious Hardesty ore sample, which had become something of a legend among geologists. Ware agreed, on one condition, that he could personally deliver the artifacts. The journey north rekindled something in him. As the train rolled through the Platte country, he watched the land unfold endless grass, then rising ridges, then the broken teeth of the Rockies against the sky. The passengers chattered of politics, gold strikes, and land grants. But Ware heard only silence between the wheels, the silence of an older America buried beneath tracks and progress. In Pinedale, he stopped at the Museum of the Mountain Man, where the reconstructed ironwood cabin still stood. Time had worn its edges smooth, but the old strength remained. The curator, a young woman named Clara Houghton, led him through the exhibit. "He built this by hand?" she asked softly. "So the story goes," Ware replied. "A blacksmith from Missouri, Hardesty. Never claimed fame, never sought wealth, just built something the world couldn't break." Clara touched one of the timbers. "They say the wood's fused with ash and clay, almost like stone." Ware smiled faintly. "Because he mixed the two. Fire teaches things a hammer never will." He placed his palm on the wall, feeling the faint coolness beneath the varnish. For a moment, he imagined he could still hear the wind moving through the seams, the distant crack of ice on the Madison. "He left his mark," Ware murmured. "Every man leaves something, most just don't know what it'll become." That night, long after the museum closed, Ware sat alone beside the cabin, his lantern casting thin shadows across the logs. He opened Hardesty's journal, his own annotated copy, dog-eared and fragile, and reread the line that had haunted him since youth. "The mountain remembers what we forget." He whispered the words aloud, and the echo seemed to come back from the darkened timber. It struck him suddenly that perhaps the map, the mine, the cross, all of it, had never been about silver at all. Hardesty's map might have been a riddle, not of land but of endurance. The mountains were not something to find, they were something to survive, something to mirror in one's own heart. Ware closed the book and leaned back, smiling in the lantern's glow. You drew the mountains inside yourself, didn't you?" he said softly, as if the old trapper could hear. The next morning, Clara found him still seated beside the cabin, hat on his knee, eyes closed, the journal resting against his chest. He was gone peaceful, as though he'd simply fallen asleep while listening to the wood breathe. The museum buried him on a small rise overlooking the valley. Beneath his name, the stone bore only 5 words, carved at his request. He followed where maps ended. Years later, Clara found among his papers a final, unfinished map. It bore no rivers, no mountains, only faint lines like veins branching outward from a single point labeled Ironwood. At the bottom, he had written a single phrase: "To find the heart of a country, find the man who listened to it first." And so the legend of Elias Boone Hardesty passed fully into myth, not as a prospector or a trapper, but as something rarer, a craftsman who shaped silence into form. The Ironwood cabin still stands, its beams humming faintly in the Wyoming air. Scholars measure its angles, engineers marvel at its design, but those who linger longest say the same thing. When you stand inside on a quiet afternoon, with the wind caught just right between the logs, the cabin seems to breathe not with air, but with memory. And if you listen close enough, you can almost hear a man's steady hammering echo through the years, striking sparks against eternity.